The 26th circumcision. Just came back from California, from a place called Simcha Barbara, Santa Barbara it's called in the vernacular, but we like to call it Simcha Barbara. And we had a bris, we had a circumcision for a grandchild, and I just want to share with you just how wonderful that experience was. And of course there's apprehension, the child is going to cry, there's possibility of wounding, and yet the child might have cried for a couple of seconds, the child was pacified immediately, the child is healthy, and his name is Yisroel. Yisroel is the name of Jacob after he reached the highest level in his life. And so it's our wish that our son, our grandson Yisroel, should grow to reach the highest level possible. And as mentioned before concerning circumcision, that circumcision actually affects the deeper elements of one's person. For there's only so much that a person can do to his own heart, to circumcise his own heart. There's only so much charity we can give, there's only so much compassion we can have because we are limited. In order to transform evil into good, in order to transform our natures to a higher level, we have to have the covenant with God. And that comes through the circumcision, where we are willing to sacrifice a certain element of our anatomy that makes us have pleasure. And we're willing to say that all of our pleasures are directed to God according to the instructions of God. And when a person gives over all of his pleasures, not that he denies himself pleasures, but when he says that all of my pleasures are according to God's instructions, I will only eat that which God allows me to eat. I will only have relations with the kind of woman that God allows me to have relations with, and only at certain times. And the person learns to have self-control and does things according to the way God has instructed. Then what happens is that the person's physical being becomes transformed and it becomes holy. It is possible to worship God and feast. It is possible to worship God and relax and have exercise. Of course, most of the divine worship comes through the study of Torah, the study of the wisdom of God, and insight and understanding what it is that God wants. But you do have to have the sanctification of the physical, because that's part of the process of the purpose of creation. And the circumcision is part of that process, sanctifying, making holy that which people use for the most profane and self-indulgent elements. This is where I'd like to address those people that have attacked me for circumcision. First of all, I'm not a mohel. Some of you have used my picture as the infamous mohel in the Foreskin Man comic book. But I'm not a mohel. I've never circumcised. I don't know how to circumcise. Nor have I ever done mitzitza. I've just described what it is and its purpose. And all of this is part of the tradition. And there is a jihad of people like the Tin Woodsman and other people out there that want to see circumcision banned under all circumstances. The fact is that if circumcision is done to a child later on in life, it's A, more painful, and B, makes the child much more violent. Practice has shown that when it's done early, there is no trauma that child remembers. The healing is relatively simple. There is no sexual activity for the child to disturb, and the body heals itself much better. And in fact, you see from the whole circumcision that the 8th day is the optimal time for circumcision, because that's when the vitamin K, the clotting agent, comes into the person for the first time and is fresh and is able to take care of the clotting elements and to correct the cut so that the circumcision is non-invasive and non-destructive. Circumcision is a surgery of sorts, but it creates a bond between man and God that is very profound. And the reason why it creates the bond is not because of circumcision itself, but because of the divine commandment. We don't circumcise to frustrate or to demonstrate our power over our children. We do the circumcision because God has decreed so. The fact that there are several cultures where they had circumcisions is irrelevant. First of all, we do it differently than they, and secondly, it's irrelevant. The circumcision is a divine command and is a sign of the bond between the Jew and God. During the terrible days of World War II, people died like flies in places like Tashkent. Some of the Hasidim, such as my Rebbe, Rav Grubner Zatzal, took their lives in their hands to discover which people were Jewish and brought them to burial in a Jewish cemetery, because a Jew is supposed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. How did they find that they were Jewish? They had to check the circumcision. With women, they had to check the papers. But with men, the quickest way was not to look for papers, sometimes didn't have any, was to check the circumcision. And they were able to bury hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews that way. But that's not the reason for it, to identify you. The reason is because it creates a bond between ourselves and God. One more point I want to tell you. There was a case that was mentioned in the Yated Neman just last week, in which the health department prosecuted and persecuted a Jewish couple for having circumcision when the child developed herpes. The mother admitted that she had some sores in her mouth and probably was the source of the herpes, but the doctors were not interested. They didn't even do a test on the mother because they wanted to try to stick it to the mole. Now this is what's going on. The anti-circs are yelling loud and causing doctors, some of whom may themselves be anti-circs, some who are intimidated, causing doctors to try to appease them and to go after the moles. Moles are highly trained. They're experts. They're just as good as any urinary doctor, urologist, and even better. I've heard this from doctors themselves, that the mohalim are much more careful with the child than themselves. The argument that some mohalim who practice mitzitza have given herpes and caused deaths are, to what I know, are unsubstantiated. And if they are substantiated, more than likely were done by people who are not really Orthodox mohalim. Yes, you can get herpes through certain types of transmissions and touching, I guess, but for the most part it comes from sexual contact, kissing, and so on, embracing. And this does not exist among the moles. The moles stay with their wives, who are, for the most part, clean and have never had any of this kind of infection, and would never contact any kind of disease. And this is just a crock. It's just a ruse to try to prohibit a time-honored ceremony that creates a bond between ourselves and God. And you see that all the details of the commandment are actually indicative of a divine wisdom behind it. Most of the studies indicate